whole time that we are seeing right now. So thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So to start, Dr. Tondon, the first question for you is: are people with diabetes more likely to get COVID-19?
So I think the jury possibly is still out, but by and large, what is believed is that the likelihood of catching the infection perhaps is not significantly more in people with diabetes. That's what the general impression about the whole thing is. However, what is a matter of concern is not whether they're more likely to get COVID. The matter of concern is that if they unfortunately do get COVID, they are much more likely to have a more severe disease and a disease which has a lot of adverse outcomes. So that would perhaps be what one needs to be more worried about.
I think the next question around the same would be: do people with diabetes have a higher chance of serious complications from COVID 19?
Yeah, so that is the important question in this discussion, and I'll possibly spend a moment to try and take you through that. So, number one, that anybody who has diabetes, if they acquire the infection, they are definitely more likely to have more severe infection. They're definitely more likely to need hospitalization. They're definitely more likely to require intensive care, more likely to go on a ventilator, and unfortunately, more likely to succumb to the illness. For example, somebody who has diabetes is about 1.5 times more likely to succumb to the infection and about 2 times more likely to end up having severe disease. Now, this is actually, we know that the two main forms of diabetes are type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And in this instance, both of these forms of diabetes, if they get COVID infection, are more likely to have severe disease, and that's been categorically shown. The second thing which I think is important to emphasize here is that even within people who have diabetes, those who have poorly controlled diabetes, right, are much more likely to have severe outcomes. So if you have diabetes, but you've been well controlled, looked after yourself well, followed your doctor's advice well, even if you get COVID, you may not suffer worse than somebody without diabetes. But if you have poorly controlled diabetes and you acquire the infection, you're very much more likely to have an adverse outcome. And let me just wrap up this question with one more angle, and that is people with diabetes have a higher likelihood of what are called vascular complications. They could have kidney involvement, they could have eye involvement, they could have heart involvement. And again, people with diabetic vascular complications are much more likely to have an adverse outcome if they get COVID infection. There could be about a 2-fold to 2.5-fold higher risk of mortality than people without diabetes.
Thank you for walking us through the entire process, Dr. Tondon. And I think you also spoke about type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So my next question will be around that. Are the risks different for people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes? And which one of these type of diabetes, people with which one of these diabetes are at more risk?
Right. So again, in terms of the risk of catching the infection, I don't think there's a lot of difference. However, it's been shown that at equivalent levels of glucose control, people who have type 1 diabetes appear to do worse than people who have type 2 diabetes. So if for example, if you compare a person of type 1 diabetes with those who have a near normal sugar, their likelihood of having a bad outcome, including mortality, may be about 2.5-fold higher. whereas somebody with type 2 diabetes in a similar comparison may have a worse outcome, about 1.5 times more likely. So again, type 1 diabetes perhaps does a little worse than type 2 diabetes when it comes to poorer COVID related outcomes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tondon. So, for everyone who's recently joined us for the session, we are talking to Dr. Nikhil Tondon, who's the professor and head, Department of Endocrinology and Metabolism, AIMS, New Delhi, and he's answering questions related to COVID and diabetes. So, Dr. Tondon, the next question for you is: what is diabetic ketoacidosis or DKA? What does this impact people who have got COVID-19?
So, DK is traditionally an entity which happens in people with type 1 diabetes, usually. And as the word suggests, there are three letters D, K, and A. The D stands for diabetes, the K stands for ketosis, because what happens is, since this situation occurs more often in type 1 diabetes, who are totally deficient of insulin, the glucose is not being utilized for energy generation, and the fat in the body starts breaking down to provide energy to the body, and a byproduct of that fat breakdown is what is called ketone bodies. And similarly, the A refers to acidosis, which means that there's a lot of acid production inside the body. So you have three things: you have an elevation of sugar, you have production of ketone bodies, and you have an acid environment. Now, this, as I said, happens much more often in type 1 diabetes, but in the context of COVID and even otherwise, you can sometimes see this also in people with type 2 diabetes. The concern is that any severe illness in a person with diabetes can create this scenario. The problem with COVID is that not only does this happen, but for whatever group of reasons, we find that the amount of insulin required to treat this often is much, much more than what we would have done in a non-COVID situation. So severe illness, type 1 diabetes,